Magic methods are special methods that override PHP's default behavior when certain event or action is performed on an object. There are about 17 magic methods available currently in PHP, and they all begin with double underscores, and you've already seen a couple of them in this course, like construct and destruct, and we're not going to cover the constructor and destructor in this lesson, but I will leave the link in the description for that lesson if you want to check it out, or you could find it in this playlist. PHP reserves any methods defined with double underscores, so it is not recommended to define your own methods by prefixing them with double underscores unless you want to override PHP's magic method. We'll cover most of the magic methods in this lesson, but we're not going to cover all of them because some of them require certain topics that we haven't covered yet. So let's start with the get and set magic methods, and these are also sometimes called magic getter and setter methods. The magic get method gets called whenever you try to access a non-existing or inaccessible property on an object, and the magic setter method gets called whenever you try to assign a value to an undefined or inaccessible property. So for example, if we try to access a property that does not exist on an invoice object and we run the code, we get this undefined property warning. We can hook into this event by defining the magic get method, and if we type in double underscore in PHP Storm IDE, it will give us all the available magic methods, and we'll pick the magic get for this example, and it gets the name of the property that is being accessed as the argument, and then we can simply var dump here name, and if we run the code again, we see that instead of the warning, the name of the property gets printed. The same applies when assigning the value to a property that doesn't exist or is inaccessible. So for example, if we try to do something like invoice amount equals to 15, and then we echoed this out, we run the code, and this works just fine, right? Because we're able to set the properties on an object like this. We're kind of dynamically creating these properties. However, we could hook into this as well, and we could do some custom logic whenever a property that doesn't exist gets assigned to some sort of value. So if we go in here, we could define a magic set method, and the first argument that it gets is again the property name, and then the second argument is the value that we're trying to set, and let's var dump the name and the value here, and let's run the code, and as you can see, it's printing the amount and the value, and it's printing amount here because we also have the magic getter method. Now what happens if we actually have a public amount property available? If we run the code, now none of this gets printed because the property exists. However, if we change this to something like private or protected, which makes it not publicly accessible, if we run the code again, we're back to triggering the magic getter and setter methods. One of the use cases is to kind of provide the read-only access to private and protected properties. So for example, in here, you could do something like if property exists on the current object, simply return this property, otherwise return null, and this will give you some kind of error handling where instead of triggering warnings and errors, you're returning the default null value. And this would kind of give you this read-only access if you do not define the setter method. So if we comment this out, and let's say we had a constructor here where we set the amount to the given amount, and we pass something like 15 here, and let's comment that out. We run the code, it prints 15. So as you can see, even though this is not accessible publicly, we're still able to read that value, but we're not able to override it. So if we try to run this code, we're going to get error now because we have the property that exists, but it is not public, and therefore we're getting this error. If you wanted to make it mutable also, then you could define the setter method and do the same thing as this, and simply do this name equals to value, and this would only mutate the available properties. So if we run the code, we see that everything is working. So even if we set this to something like 35, we see that now we're able to change the value. Though this, in my opinion, is not the best use case for it, and I personally am not a big fan of this because for one, it breaks the encapsulation, and second, when you use type hinting, especially with strict types enabled, and you try to set a property to a value that is not the same type as your defined property, you would get an error. So then you would have to implement some kind of validation in the magic setter method and so on. So I personally don't like it, and I would not recommend using these methods this way. I just wanted to show it to you that it's possible. Another use case is that instead of defining the properties and instead of having a bunch of properties, you could store them in an array. So something like protected array data, and then instead of doing this, you could simply do if array key exists, where the key is the name that we're trying to access and the array is the data property, we would return the value from the data array. So we would do something like this data name. And same goes with the magic setter method. We would simply do this data name equals to value. Now if we run the code, we see that 35 gets set, and then when we retrieve it, it's set to 35. If we var dump invoice, we see that data array contains the amount. The next magic methods that we're going to cover are the isset and unset magic methods. So we have isset and unset. The isset method gets called when you use isset or empty functions on undefined or inaccessible properties, and unset method gets called when you use the unset function on undefined or inaccessible properties. And the magic isset method needs to return the Boolean value, so we could simply do return array key exists, where the key is the name and then the array is the data property. And for the unset, we could simply call unset on the array to remove the element from the array. Now if we go in here and we call var dump isset invoice amount and we run the code, we get this error because we haven't initialized the data property. So I need to set this to an empty array because we don't have the constructor here. So if I run it again, we get false. To ensure that this gets triggered, we can simply var dump here and call it isset, and we can var dump here and call it unset. And let's clear this out, run it again, and it's working. Now let's set the amount property on the invoice to 15. Let's run it again, and now the isset returns true. Now let's call the unset on that property, so we can do unset amount, and let's simply var dump this again, and we run it, and we see that first isset was called and this was true, then unset is called, which is right here, and then isset is again called because we have the isset here, and now it's false. Now instead of isset, we can simply just var dump the object itself, and we can var dump the object here as well, and we run the code, and we see that initially it contains the amount, which is right here, and after unset it does not contain the amount in that array. Something worth noting is that these four magic methods will not get called in the context of statics. So if you try to access a variable that does not exist, which is static, then this is going to result in an error. So if I run it, we're going to get this error, and the magic get method is not going to be called because these four magic methods require objects. Also, I want to mention that these magic methods are not meant to replace the standard getter and setter methods. They're useful when you want to have special handling when undefined or inaccessible property is being accessed or being set. Let's move on. So I'm going to delete these magic methods from here, and then the next magic methods we're going to cover are the call and call static magic methods. So if we try to call a method that does not exist on an object, something like process, for example, this will result in an error, right? If we run it, we get that fatal error. However, you can hook into that as well, and you can define the magic call method, and let's var dump name and arguments, and we run it again, and we see that we no longer get the error. Instead, it prints the name of the method and the arguments that were passed into that method. So as you notice, this magic method gets two arguments. The first one is the name of the method that is being called, and second is the arguments that are being passed into that method call. So if we passed 1, 2, 3 here, we run it again, we see that those arguments are captured and available within the arguments array. This magic method does not get triggered whenever a static method call is made. So if you try to call this method statically, this way we run the code, we're going to get the fatal error. For that case, you have another magic method called call static, which needs to be defined as the static method, and now we var dump here, and let's say that this is static. We run the code again, and we see that now we no longer get the error. Now this is actually very powerful, and you will see this being used in popular frameworks like Laravel, for example, to sprinkle some of that magic into the framework that sometimes developers don't know how it actually works behind the scenes. For example, you could use these methods to defer the calls to another object, or even within this object. If we had a method available process here, so if we defined public function process, and let's say we var dumped process here, we go to index.php and we try to call it on the object, we run the code, now it's simply calling that method because it's available. If we change this again to be inaccessible, something like protected or private, we run it, now again the magic method is called. You could use this magic method to simply do something like if method exists on the current object, then call the method. We run the code and you see that it's running the process method. But there's a problem with this, because what if this process process method accepted some arguments like amount and description, how would we pass these arguments to this method call here? If we simply pass in the arguments here, and let's say that this was float, now when we call process here, we pass in 15 and some description. When we run the code, this is going to result in error because the argument that is being passed into the process method is an array, because it's passing the entire arguments array as the first argument. So instead of the float, we're getting an array. To solve this problem, you could use a function called callUserFuncArray, which accepts a callable, or you could simply pass in an array where the first element is the object where you want to call the method on, and in this case that is this, and the second element is the name of the method, which is name, and then second argument that you pass is the arguments, and we have that arguments captured right here. So we pass that in, we run the code, and now no more errors. It's calling process method with the correct arguments. In fact, we can simply var dump the amount and description, and we run it, and it's working as expected. And same would apply to call static. You would check if the method exists on some sort of object, and then you would defer that call. This makes both of these magic methods very powerful. That allows you to sprinkle a bit of magic to your code base. You're able to defer the method calls to other objects which do not have to be the current object. In this example, I used the current object to call the protected method, but you could essentially resolve another object, maybe from a container, and call the method on that object instead. I used the current object simply to demonstrate as an example. You could even call non-static methods statically by resolving the object within the call static magic method and then defer the call to that object. This is exactly how Laravel framework's facades work behind the scenes. Don't get overwhelmed by this. You don't need to worry about this for now. Just wanted to give you an idea on how they are used. The next magic method that we're going to look at is a toString method, which gets called whenever you try to interact with the object as string. Maybe you try to echo it out or cast it into a string. So that is underscore underscore toString, and you must return string. So we can simply return hello for now, and we go to index and we try to echo invoice. We run the code, this prints hello. If we comment this out and we run it again, we get this error that the object cannot be converted to string. This makes things very flexible because now you can have objects that can be interacted with as strings. You could return something like this invoice with amount 55 was processed on this date and so on. One thing to note here is that if you try to return something other than string, like an integer for example, this will work only if you're not in strict mode. If you were in strict mode where we declare strict types, as you can see the IDE is underlining it here, and if we run the code we're going to get this error. So just make sure that this always returns string even when you're not using strict types. Another thing to note is that since PHP 8, classes that define the magic toString method will implicitly implement the stringable interface. So if we go to index.php and we var dump invoice instance of stringable, which is an interface offered by PHP, if we run this code, we see that it's returning true. And this implicit implementation happens since PHP 8. Prior to PHP 8, you would have to explicitly implement the stringable interface. And if we click into it, the stringable, we see that it has the toString method declaration, which means that all classes that implement this interface must define toString method. So this is good in a way to force the class to define the toString method, but it is no longer required. If you're defining the toString method, this class will implicitly implement stringable interface. Next magic method that we're going to cover is called invoke. And this method gets triggered when you try to call the object directly. So if we go to index.php and we try to simply call the object this way, we go here and we simply var dump invoked. We run the code, we see that it's printing invoked. If we comment this out and we run it, we'll get that fatal error that it is not callable. In fact, we can simply var dump if the object is callable, and we run the code and we get false. But when we define invoke magic method and we run the code, we see that now it's true and it prints invoked. This magic method is very useful to implement single action classes, and I use it quite often when I want to have single responsibility classes where class is responsible for only a single thing. For example, if this class was called something like process invoice instead of the generic invoice, I am indicating by the class name that this class is supposed to process invoice. Putting other logic in this class would not really make sense and kind of break that single responsibility principle that we'll talk about later, and therefore I don't need a bunch of methods here. I actually need a single method, and instead of defining that single method, I can simply make it invocable and invoke that call by simply calling the object directly. Hope that makes sense. Please let me know in the comments what do you think about this and if you have any questions or feedback. And finally, we have the debug info magic method, which is underscore underscore debug info, and this should return either null or an array that should be printed when you var dump the object. So for example, if I comment this out for now, and we had some private properties here like float amount and private int ID and maybe private string account number, and then we simply var dump the invoice and we run the code, we see that it's printing object with all of its available properties, even the private ones. So if we had some sensitive info in here, we could use the debug info to specify exactly what should be printed when var dump is used. So in here we could do return an empty array, for example, and now when we var dump, nothing gets printed, but we could make it so that it returns ID and maybe returns account number, but only returns the last 4 digits of the account number, and returns something like this, and substring this account number -4, and this is supposed to be this ID, and we run the code and we're going to get this error because we haven't initialized these values. So let's put some values here. We run the code, we see that now account number is only var dumped with last 4 digits. So as you can see, this can be useful, though I haven't really used this method a lot in my applications. I only use them once or twice, but it's still good to know that this is available when needed. We'll talk about some other magic methods like clone, wake up, serialize, unserialize, and sleep in separate videos once we cover object cloning and serialization. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy my videos and want to see more. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and the bell notification icon to make sure that you don't miss any of my new videos. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.